The klaxons screamed through submarine B-59 like the wails of the damned. 300 feet beneath the Caribbean Sea, in a steel coffin that reeked of diesel and desperation, the fate of humanity balanced on a knife's edge. October 27, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis had reached its breaking point. Captain Valentin Savitsky stood over the nuclear torpedo authorization panel, his sweat-soaked uniform clinging to his trembling frame. The T-5 torpedo in tube number 2 contained 15 kilotons of atomic fury, enough destructive power to vaporize the American fleet overhead and ignite World War III. 2 signatures already marked the launch authorization. Savitsky's angry scrawl. Political officer Maslenikov's ideological flourish. Soviet protocol demanded 3 approvals to unleash nuclear fire. Only one man stood between a regional crisis and global annihilation. Deputy Commander Vasili Arkhipov stared at the document thrust toward him. Above their heads, American destroyers dropped depth charges that shook the submarine's hull like thunder. His crew was dying from heat and poisoned air. His captain demanded immediate nuclear retaliation. In that moment of ultimate decision, when civilization hung by a thread in the depths of the Caribbean Sea, one man would choose humanity's future. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov emerged from the crucible of Soviet suffering. Born January 30, 1926, in Staraya Kupovna, a village where wooden houses dotted the frozen landscape near Moscow. His childhood unfolded against Stalin's terror, where neighbors vanished in midnight arrests and families learned to whisper their doubts. The boy who would one day prevent nuclear war grew up understanding that survival required wisdom beyond his years. The Great Patriotic War arrived when Arkhipov turned 15. Nazi armies carved through Soviet territory like scythes through wheat, reaching Moscow's suburbs before winter, and determination stopped their advance. Young Vasily witnessed the true face of modern warfare. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead from bullets, bombs, and starvation. The war taught him that violence, once unleashed, consumed everything in its path with mechanical efficiency. After victory's bitter celebration, Arkhipov entered the Pacific Higher Naval School in Vladivostok. The submarine service attracted the Soviet Navy's finest officers, men capable of functioning in cramped steel tubes beneath hostile waters. His instructors noted his methodical mind and unshakable composure under pressure. Unlike career officers who saw warfare as glorious adventure, Arkhipov understood destruction's terrible mathematics. The nuclear age transformed submarines from hunters into potential destroyers of civilization. Soviet boats began carrying atomic weapons that could obliterate entire naval fleets with single shots. Arkhipov mastered the protocols governing these weapons, learning that split-second decisions could determine whether tactical engagements escalated into global catastrophe. His first encounter with nuclear danger came aboard. Submarine. K 19 inches, July 1961. A reactor coolant leak threatened meltdown that would have killed everyone aboard and contaminated vast areas of the North Atlantic. As deputy commander, Arkhipov helped coordinate desperate repair efforts while radiation levels soared throughout the vessel. Engineering crews worked without proper protection, accepting probable death to prevent catastrophic explosion. The K-19 incident taught Arkhipov that nuclear technology, despite its awesome power, remained fundamentally unpredictable. Sophisticated systems failed in ways that designers never anticipated. Human judgment became the final safeguard against technological disasters that could kill thousands. The experience reinforced his natural caution about nuclear weapons and skepticism toward purely technical solutions to human problems. Soviet submarine doctrine emphasized aggressive action and immediate retaliation against enemy attacks. Officers learned to interpret any assault on their vessels as acts of war requiring nuclear response. This mindset created a military culture where hesitation was weakness and restraint was betrayal. Nuclear weapons weren't just ultimate deterrents, but symbols of revolutionary power that must be used when circumstances demanded. By 1962, Arkhipov had earned recognition as one of the Soviet Navy's most competent submarine officers. His superiors valued his technical expertise and calm temperament under extreme conditions. Unlike many colleagues who viewed nuclear weapons primarily as instruments of intimidation, Arkhipov grasped their capacity for uncontrolled escalation. This understanding would prove crucial when B-59 found itself trapped beneath the Caribbean Sea. His assignment as deputy commander placed him at the center of Soviet naval strategy during the Cold War's most dangerous period. The submarine would carry nuclear weapons into hostile waters, operating under rules of engagement that could trigger global destruction. His judgment and moral courage would soon face tests that no training could adequately prepare him for. The plan that would bring Vasili Arkhipov face-to-face with nuclear war began in the Kremlin's most secure conference rooms. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, humiliated by American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Britain, decided to place Soviet nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida's coast. Operation Anadyr represented the most audacious gamble of the Cold War, a secret deployment that would shift the nuclear balance decisively toward Moscow. The operation demanded unprecedented deception and logistical coordination. Cargo ships would transport medium-range ballistic missiles disguised as agricultural equipment. Soviet technicians would travel to Cuba as irrigation specialists and crop advisors. Most critically, 4 Foxtrot-class submarines would provide underwater protection for the missile installations, ensuring American naval forces could not prevent the weapons' deployment through conventional blockade. Submarine B-59 received the mission's most sensitive component. Beyond conventional torpedoes and standard armament, the vessel would carry a single T-5 nuclear torpedo, a weapon whose existence remained unknown to American intelligence agencies. The 15-kiloton warhead could destroy an entire naval task force with one shot, giving Soviet forces overwhelming tactical advantage in Caribbean waters. The nuclear torpedo represented a new category of warfare that blurred traditional distinctions between tactical and strategic weapons. Unlike intercontinental missiles aimed at cities, this device was designed for battlefield use against military targets. Soviet planners believed they could employ tactical nuclear weapons without triggering full-scale nuclear exchange between the superpowers. This assumption would prove dangerously naive when tested under actual combat conditions. Command protocols for the nuclear torpedo reflected both the weapon's importance and its terrible danger. Soviet naval regulations required unanimous consent from 3 senior officers before any nuclear weapon could be fired. The submarine's captain, political officer, and deputy commander all had to agree that circumstances justified nuclear escalation. This safeguard was designed to prevent accidental launches while ensuring that legitimate threats would receive devastating response. Arkhipov understood the crushing weight of responsibility that accompanied his new assignment. His signature on a firing authorization would help determine whether a local naval engagement escalated into global nuclear war. The burden was simultaneously professional and moral. Military training demanded that he support his captain's tactical decisions. Human conscience required him to consider the broader consequences of unleashing atomic weapons in anger. The crew of B-59 received minimal information about their true mission as they prepared for Caribbean deployment. Most sailors believed they were conducting routine training exercises in international waters. Only senior officers knew about the nuclear torpedo and the broader context of Operation Anadyr. This operational security was necessary for mission success, but it also meant that crucial decisions would be made by a handful of men operating under extreme stress without complete knowledge of the political situation. B-59 departed from Gadjevo Naval Base on October 1, 1962, joining 3 sister submarines in a covert journey toward Cuban waters. The voyage began quietly, with the boats maintaining radio silence and avoiding detection by NATO surveillance networks. Soviet naval intelligence had identified gaps in American monitoring that would theoretically allow the submarines to reach their operational areas undetected. The international situation deteriorated rapidly during the submarine's Atlantic crossing. American U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, revealing Khrushchev's secret deployment to an outraged Kennedy administration. The American president imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba, effectively declaring that any vessel carrying offensive weapons would be intercepted by overwhelming force. The 4 Soviet submarines suddenly found themselves attempting to run a blockade that could trigger the war they were supposed to prevent. Communication between Moscow and the submarines became sporadic and unreliable as they approached Cuban waters. Soviet naval headquarters had not anticipated the speed with which the crisis would escalate or the intensity of American surveillance operations. The submarine commanders found themselves operating under outdated orders in a rapidly changing environment where miscalculation could prove fatal. October 14, 1962, shattered the fragile peace that had existed between the superpowers since the Berlin crisis. Major Richard Hazer's U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba captured photographic evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles under construction, weapons capable of striking American cities from Washington to New Orleans within minutes of launch. The images reached President Kennedy's desk 2 days later, initiating 13 days of crisis that brought humanity closer to nuclear war than any previous confrontation. Kennedy's response combined public firmness with private desperation to avoid military conflict. On October 22, he announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, declaring that any ship carrying offensive weapons would be intercepted by the United States Navy. American military forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest state of alert short of actual war. Strategic Air Command bombers loaded with nuclear weapons began continuous airborne patrols while intercontinental ballistic missiles in underground silos were armed and targeted at Soviet cities. The Soviet Union matched American preparations with its own massive military mobilization. Nuclear forces throughout the Warsaw Pact achieved maximum readiness levels. Soviet submarines and surface vessels received orders to challenge the American quarantine using all necessary means. Most ominously, Soviet commanders in Cuba were granted tactical authority to use nuclear weapons if invaded, removing Moscow's direct control over nuclear escalation decisions. The 4 Soviet submarines approaching Cuba found themselves at the epicenter of this escalating crisis. B-59, B-36, B-4, and B-6 had been traveling submerged to avoid detection, but American sonar operators began identifying their approximate positions as they neared the quarantine line. United States Navy destroyers initiated aggressive pursuit operations, using active sonar and practice depth charges to force the submarines to surface for identification and inspection. Communication between the submarines and Moscow became increasingly difficult as American electronic warfare systems jammed Soviet radio frequencies across the Caribbean. The submarine commanders lost reliable contact with their headquarters precisely when the crisis reached its most dangerous phase. They were operating effectively blind, uncertain whether war had already begun, and unclear about their authority to use the nuclear weapons aboard their vessels. American naval forces interpreted the Soviet submarines as direct threats to the quarantine's effectiveness. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara authorized the use of practice depth charges to compel the submarines to surface, unaware that some of these vessels carried nuclear torpedoes capable of destroying entire task forces. The depth charges were specifically designed to avoid fatal damage while maximizing psychological pressure on submarine crews. Soviet submarine doctrine assumed that any attack on their vessels constituted an act of war requiring immediate nuclear retaliation. The depth charges exploding around their hulls seemed to confirm that hostilities had commenced between the superpowers. Without radio contact to verify the broader strategic situation, submarine commanders faced the terrifying possibility that nuclear war had already started and they were among the last Soviet forces still capable of striking back. The psychological pressure on submarine crews reached unbearable levels as they remained submerged for extended periods while under continuous attack. Internal temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, while carbon dioxide concentrations rose to dangerous levels. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and dehydration as the cramped conditions and toxic atmosphere pushed trained naval officers toward complete breakdown. Intelligence reports reaching Washington painted an incomplete and potentially catastrophic picture of the submarine threat. American officials knew that Soviet vessels were approaching Cuba, but they remained completely unaware of the nuclear weapons aboard these boats. This ignorance led to tactical decisions that could have triggered nuclear escalation if submarine commanders had interpreted practice depth charges as genuine attempts at tactical standoff the genuine sleeve. Destruction. The crisis spiraled beyond the control of leaders in both Moscow and Washington who desperately wanted to avoid nuclear war. Kennedy and Khrushchev understood the catastrophic consequences of military conflict, but their armed forces were implementing policies that made such conflict increasingly probable. Submarine commanders operating without communication were making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information and doctrinal assumptions that might no longer apply to the rapidly evolving situation. By October 27th, the most dangerous day of the entire crisis, both superpowers had reached the point where a single miscalculation could trigger global catastrophe. Major Rudolf Anderson's U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot and raising tensions to unprecedented levels. In this atmosphere of mutual threat and fundamental misunderstanding, B-59 found itself trapped beneath American warships with a nuclear weapon that could transform a tense standoff into the beginning of World War III. The hunt for Soviet submarine B-59 began with a whisper in the depths. October 26, 1962, USS Beale's sonar operator detected the distinctive acoustic signature of a Foxtrot-class submarine running submerged 30 nautical miles northeast of Cuba. The contact was faint but unmistakable, the rhythmic beat of electric motors and the subtle disturbance of water displaced by a steel hull. Within hours, additional destroyers converged on the area like wolves responding to a scent. Captain Valentin Savitsky realized his submarine had been compromised when American sonar buoys began splashing into the water around his position. The passive listening devices created an underwater surveillance network that would track B-59's movements regardless of how quietly the submarine operated. Savitsky ordered his crew to reduce speed and minimize noise, but he understood that American naval forces would eventually corner his vessel like hunters driving prey toward waiting guns. The cat-and-mouse game that followed tested the endurance and skill of both American and Soviet sailors. B-59 attempted to evade detection by changing course frequently and operating at different depths, using thermal layers and underwater currents to mask its acoustic signature. American destroyers responded by coordinating their search efforts, employing multiple vessels to maintain continuous contact while preventing the submarine from reaching Cuban territorial waters. Arkhipov monitored the tactical situation from his position in the submarine's command center, watching as each passing hour brought new challenges and diminishing options. Battery power was draining steadily as the submarine maneuvered to avoid detection. Life support systems struggled to maintain breathable air as carbon dioxide levels rose throughout the vessel. The crew was approaching physical and psychological exhaustion after 18 hours of continuous submergence while under pursuit. The American destroyers employed increasingly aggressive tactics designed to force B-59 to surface for identification. Practice depth charges exploded at calculated distances from the submarine, creating underwater shock waves that rattled the vessel without causing serious structural damage. American naval doctrine assumed that Soviet submarines would surface when faced with overwhelming force, allowing for peaceful escort away from Cuban waters. Soviet submarine doctrine interpreted any attack as an act of war requiring immediate retaliation against enemy forces. The depth charges exploding around B-59 seemed to confirm that hostilities had begun between the superpowers without warning or declaration. Without radio communication to verify the broader strategic situation, Captain Savitsky had no way to determine whether the explosions represented warning shots or actual combat operations intended to sink his submarine. The psychological impact of the depth charges on B-59's crew was immediate and devastating. Men who had trained extensively for underwater combat found themselves helpless against weapons they could hear but not see or engage. The underwater explosions created a disorienting environment where normal references for time and space became meaningless. Some crew members began showing signs of panic and psychological breakdown as the bombardment continued hour after hour. Arkhipov attempted to maintain calm among his officers while analyzing the deteriorating tactical situation. His experience aboard K-19 had taught him that panic represented a greater danger than any external threat to submarine operations. Keeping the crew functional required steady leadership and rational decision-making, even under conditions that pushed human endurance well beyond normal limits. American naval commanders faced their own uncertainties about the engagement they were conducting. Intelligence reports had identified Soviet submarines approaching Cuba, but provided no information about nuclear weapons aboard these vessels. The decision to use practice depth charges assumed that submarine crews would recognize the non-lethal nature of the bombardment and respond by surfacing for peaceful inspection. The communication blackout that prevented B-59 from contacting Moscow also limited American understanding of Soviet intentions and capabilities. Without diplomatic channels to clarify the submarine's mission or armament, both sides were operating on assumptions that might prove dangerously incorrect. The tactical engagement was escalating beyond the control of political leaders who wanted desperately to avoid military confrontation. As the chase continued through the night of October 26th and into the early hours of October 27th, physical conditions aboard B-59 reached critical levels that threatened crew survival. Internal temperatures exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit in some compartments, while carbon dioxide concentrations approached levels that could cause unconsciousness and death. The submarine's batteries were nearly depleted, making continued submergence impossible within the next few hours. Captain Savitsky faced an impossible choice between tactical humiliation and crew survival. Surfacing would expose his submarine to overwhelming American firepower and likely result in capture or destruction. Remaining submerged would soon cause crew deaths from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning. Neither option offered hope of completing his original mission or returning safely to Soviet naval bases. Dawn on October 27th brought no relief to the men trapped inside submarine B-59. 24 hours of submergence while under attack had transformed the steel vessel into a floating hell. Internal temperatures soared past 140 degrees Fahrenheit as the submarine's air conditioning systems failed under the strain of extended operations. The atmosphere grew thick with carbon dioxide and the acrid smell of overheating electronics that pushed the crew toward collapse. Captain Valentin Savitsky moved through his submarine like a man possessed by fury and desperation. His uniform hung in tatters, soaked with sweat and stained with the grease and condensation that coated every surface. The depth charges that had been exploding around his vessel for hours seemed to mock his helplessness and professional pride. Here he commanded one of the Soviet Navy's most advanced submarines, yet he was trapped like prey by American hunting tactics. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of conventional escape or mission completion. B-59's batteries were nearly exhausted, leaving insufficient power for high-speed maneuvering or extended submergence. The submarine's life support systems were failing catastrophically, creating atmospheric conditions that would soon become lethal to human life. Multiple American destroyers maintained sonar contact from positions that made surface escape impossible without facing overwhelming enemy firepower. Arkhipov struggled to maintain his composure as he witnessed his crew's rapid deterioration under conditions that exceeded all previous training and experience. Trained naval personnel were beginning to show signs of complete psychological breakdown. Some men wept openly at their duty stations while others stared blankly ahead, their minds no longer processing the chaos surrounding them. The submarine that had seemed so powerful during its Atlantic crossing now felt like a metal tomb slowly filling with poisonous gas. Communication attempts with Soviet naval headquarters yielded only static and electronic interference as American jamming operations severed the submarine's final link with Moscow. The loss of contact came precisely when guidance was most desperately needed from higher authority. Without orders or clarification from command, Captain Savitsky was forced to interpret the deteriorating situation using his own judgment and doctrinal training that emphasized aggressive response to enemy attacks. The depth charges continued their methodical assault on crew morale and submarine systems with mechanical precision. Each underwater explosion sent shockwaves through the hull, causing equipment failures and psychological trauma that accumulated with each successive detonation. The American weapons were calibrated to maximize intimidation while avoiding fatal damage, but Soviet crews had no way to distinguish between practice rounds and genuine attempts at destruction. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov emerged as the most vocal advocate for immediate nuclear retaliation against the American fleet surrounding their submarine. His ideological training emphasized that Soviet naval forces must never submit to capitalist aggression under any circumstances. The depth charges represented an intolerable insult to Soviet sovereignty and revolutionary principles that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. Any hesitation would constitute cowardice and betrayal of the socialist cause. The submarine's nuclear torpedo waited in tube number 2, armed and ready for immediate launch against the American destroyers overhead. The T-5 weapon contained a 15-kiloton warhead capable of vaporizing everything within a 5-mile radius of the detonation point. One command from Captain Savitsky would send atomic fire racing toward the surface, achieving tactical victory while potentially triggering global nuclear war between the superpowers. Savitsky's anger had reached levels that bordered on madness as hours of humiliation under American attack convinced him that national honor demanded nuclear retaliation regardless of broader consequences. The torpedo offered a way to strike back decisively against enemies who had trapped his submarine and threatened his crew's survival. Soviet naval doctrine supported his reasoning by defining any attack on Soviet vessels as an act of war requiring immediate nuclear response. The captain's hand moved toward the firing authorization mechanism as he prepared to launch the nuclear torpedo against the American fleet. According to Soviet military regulations, 3 senior officers had to provide unanimous consent before any nuclear weapon could be fired. Captain Savitsky provided the first authorization with an angry signature. Political officer Maslenikov quickly added his ideological approval. Only Deputy Commander Archipov's consent was needed to complete the firing sequence. The moment that would determine the fate of human civilization had arrived in the cramped, overheated command center of a Soviet submarine trapped beneath the Caribbean Sea. 3 men representing different perspectives and experiences within the Soviet military hierarchy faced a decision that would either prevent or trigger nuclear war. The toxic atmosphere, physical exhaustion, and psychological pressure had reduced this ultimate moment to its most basic elements. Launch the torpedo and start World War III, or refuse and face unknown consequences. Arkhipov stared at the authorization document that Savitsky thrust toward him with trembling hands. The paper seemed to glow with malevolent energy in the submarine's dim emergency lighting. His signature would unleash atomic forces that neither superpower could control once released. The depth charges exploding overhead had created a crisis where rational thought competed with rage, fear, and nationalist pride for control of human destiny. The T-5 nuclear torpedo represented the pinnacle of Soviet underwater warfare technology, 15 kilotons of destructive power compressed into a weapon barely 20 feet in length. The warhead contained enough fissile material to obliterate an area equivalent to downtown Manhattan, transforming the Caribbean Sea into a radioactive graveyard. Unlike the strategic missiles being deployed in Cuba, This tactical nuclear weapon was designed for immediate battlefield use against military targets. Captain Savitsky's decision to arm the torpedo reflected both his tactical desperation and his interpretation of Soviet naval doctrine under extreme combat conditions. The continuous depth charge attacks had convinced him that war between the superpowers had already begun without formal declaration. Cut off from communication with Moscow, he assumed that Soviet forces throughout the world were under coordinated attack, and that B-59 represented one of the few remaining weapons capable of striking back effectively. The torpedo's target acquisition system had already identified multiple American destroyers operating directly overhead, their sonar signatures clearly visible on the submarine's detection equipment. The weapon's guidance system would home in on the largest radar reflection, most likely the destroyer that had been most aggressive in its pursuit of B-59. The nuclear detonation would vaporize that vessel instantly, while creating a radioactive shock wave that would cripple or destroy every American ship within several miles. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov provided immediate and enthusiastic support for the nuclear attack, viewing it as both tactically necessary and ideologically justified. His training emphasized that Soviet forces must never submit to capitalist aggression under any circumstances. The American depth charges represented an intolerable assault on Soviet sovereignty that demanded overwhelming retaliation. From his perspective, using nuclear weapons against military targets was not only permissible but morally required. Maslenikov's worldview had been shaped by decades of Cold War propaganda that portrayed the United States as an existential threat to socialist civilization worldwide. American imperialism, according to this ideological framework, would eventually attempt to destroy the Soviet Union through military force. The current situation seemed to validate these predictions completely, justifying the use of any weapon necessary to defend the revolution and its achievements. The cramped command center of B-59 became an arena where three different philosophies of nuclear warfare competed for supremacy over human destiny. Captain Savitsky represented the traditional military perspective that emphasized decisive action and immediate retaliation against enemy attacks. Political officer Maslenikov embodied the ideological conviction that nuclear weapons were tools of revolutionary justice. Deputy Commander Arkhipov would have to choose between these positions or offer an alternative approach. Soviet submarine doctrine regarding nuclear weapons reflected the broader strategic thinking that dominated military planning during the early 1960s. Tactical nuclear weapons were viewed as natural extensions of conventional combat, usable in specific battlefield situations without necessarily triggering strategic nuclear exchange between the superpowers. This assumption, like many aspects of nuclear strategy, had never been tested under actual combat conditions. The authorization protocol for nuclear weapon launch required unanimous consent from 3 senior officers precisely because the consequences of such decisions extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. The system was designed to prevent hasty or emotional decisions while ensuring that legitimate threats would receive appropriate response. However, the protocol assumed that officers would have access to accurate information about the broader strategic situation. Arkhipov's experience aboard the K-19 nuclear submarine had provided him with unique insight into the unpredictable nature of nuclear technology under extreme conditions. He had witnessed firsthand how sophisticated systems could fail catastrophically, and how split-second decisions made under intense pressure could determine whether crews lived or died. This background made him naturally cautious about nuclear weapons and deeply skeptical of purely technical solutions to complex human problems. The deputy commander's analytical mind rebelled against the logic of nuclear escalation in their current tactical situation. If American forces had truly intended to sink B-59, they possessed conventional weapons more than adequate for that purpose. The depth charges, while psychologically devastating to the crew, had been carefully calibrated to avoid fatal damage to the submarine. This pattern suggested intimidation rather than genuine combat operations. Most significantly, Arkhipov questioned whether launching a nuclear torpedo would achieve any positive outcome for B-59 or Soviet interests more generally. The weapon would certainly destroy several American warships and kill hundreds of sailors in the process. However, it would also reveal the existence of Soviet nuclear weapons in Caribbean waters and provide complete justification for massive American retaliation against Soviet forces throughout the region. The tactical situation aboard B-59 had deteriorated to the point where rational analysis became extremely difficult for officers operating under conditions that pushed human judgment to its absolute limits. Physical exhaustion, toxic atmospheric conditions, and overwhelming psychological pressure created an environment where emotional responses threatened to overwhelm professional decision-making capabilities. In this chaos, Arkhipov had to weigh immediate crew morale against global strategic consequences. Captain Savitsky grew increasingly agitated as Arkhipov hesitated to provide his authorization for the nuclear launch, interpreting any delay as cowardice or disloyalty to Soviet principles. The captain's anger was compounded by the continuing depth charge attacks and the obvious deterioration of his crew's physical and psychological condition. Every minute of indecision seemed to represent another humiliation at the hands of American naval forces who had reduced his once proud submarine to a helpless target. Vasili Arkhipov looked into the eyes of Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov, seeing the madness that extreme stress and poisoned air had created in men he had served alongside for years. The authorization document trembled in Savitsky's outstretched hand, while Maslenikov nodded encouragingly from his position across the command center. The nuclear torpedo waited in tube number 2, its 15-kiloton warhead ready to transform a tense naval standoff into the opening battle of World War III. The weight of his decision pressed down on Arkhipov like the thousands of tons of seawater above their trapped submarine. He understood the tactical logic that drove his colleagues toward nuclear escalation with mechanical precision. They had been attacked by enemy forces while operating under orders to protect Soviet interests in Cuban waters. Military doctrine demanded immediate retaliation against such aggression. National honor required that they strike back against capitalist forces attempting to humiliate the Soviet Navy. Yet something fundamental in Archipov's character rebelled against the nuclear option with instinctive revulsion. His engineering background demanded rational analysis of cause and effect relationships. If the Americans had wanted to destroy B-59, they possessed conventional weapons more than adequate for that purpose. The fact that his submarine remained intact after hours of depth charging suggested that the American attacks were intended as warnings rather than genuine attempts at destruction. More importantly, Arkhipov grasped the broader implications of nuclear escalation in ways that his colleagues, focused intensely on immediate tactical considerations, seemed unable or unwilling to appreciate. Launching the torpedo would certainly destroy several American warships and demonstrate Soviet resolve under pressure. However, it would also provide complete justification for massive retaliation against Soviet forces throughout the Caribbean region, transforming tactical victory into strategic disaster of unprecedented proportions. His refusal to authorize the nuclear launch stunned both Savitsky and Maslenikov into momentary silence before exploding into furious argument. How could the deputy commander ignore direct attacks on their vessel by enemy forces? What possible justification existed for allowing American naval units to continue their aggressive pursuit without immediate and devastating retaliation? The two men demanded explanations that Arkhipov found extremely difficult to articulate under the extreme conditions prevailing throughout the submarine. The heated argument that followed tested relationships and loyalties that had been built over years of shared service in the Soviet Navy's submarine force. Savitsky accused Arkhipov of cowardice and betrayal of fundamental Soviet principles. Maslenikov questioned whether the deputy commander possessed the ideological commitment necessary for service in the Revolutionary Navy. These personal attacks, delivered in the toxic atmosphere of a failing submarine, created psychological wounds that would never completely heal. Arkhipov maintained his position, despite intense pressure from his colleagues and the rapidly deteriorating conditions aboard B-59 that threatened the crew's survival. He argued that launching nuclear weapons without clear evidence of general war between the superpowers would exceed their authority and potentially trigger the very conflict they were supposed to prevent. The submarine's mission was to protect Soviet interests in Cuba, not to start World War III based on tactical misunderstandings and communication failures. The stalemate that developed in B-59's command center reflected the broader crisis of nuclear decision-making that plagued military forces during the Cold War era. Officers trained exclusively for conventional warfare found themselves wielding weapons whose consequences extended far beyond traditional military objectives. The compressed timeline of underwater combat left no opportunity for careful analysis or consultation with higher political authority in Moscow. Captain Savitsky's fury at his deputy commander's refusal gradually transformed into grudging recognition that continued submergence would soon result in the deaths of his highs. Entire crew from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning. The submarine's life support systems were failing catastrophically. Battery power was nearly exhausted, and men were collapsing from dehydration throughout the vessel. Regardless of tactical considerations, B-59 would have to surface within the next hour or face the certain loss of all personnel. The decision to surface represented the ultimate humiliation for a submarine captain who had spent his entire career preparing to avoid precisely this situation. Surfacing while surrounded by overwhelming enemy naval forces would expose B-59 to devastating firepower and likely result in capture or destruction of his vessel. The alternative was certain death for 79 Soviet sailors from the toxic atmospheric conditions that had developed during their prolonged submergence. The submarine's emergency surface procedure brought B-59 up from the depths like a steel whale breaching desperately in search of life-giving air. As the vessel broke the surface of the Caribbean Sea, Captain Savitsky and his crew found themselves face to face with the American naval force that had been pursuing them relentlessly. 4 destroyers surrounded the Soviet submarine, their guns trained on the dark hull that emerged from the blue-green waters. The standoff that followed represented one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis period. American and Soviet sailors stared at each other across a few hundred yards of ocean, both sides armed and ready for combat that could escalate rapidly beyond anyone's ability to control. The slightest provocation or misunderstanding could trigger a firefight that would spread throughout the Caribbean region within hours. Nuclear weapons remained aboard B-59, though American forces had no knowledge of their existence or the debate that had just occurred in the submarine's command center. The discipline shown by both American and Soviet sailors during this critical period probably prevented the incident from escalating into actual combat. Professional military training overcame nationalist emotions as both crews recognized the catastrophic potential of any aggressive action under these circumstances. Eventually, American commanders agreed to allow B-59 to withdraw from the area without inspection, provided the submarine departed Caribbean waters immediately and did not return. This face-saving compromise allowed both sides to avoid the humiliation and escalation that direct confrontation would have created inevitably. The Soviet submarine began its long journey back to Russian naval bases, carrying its nuclear secret away from the crisis zone where it could have triggered global catastrophe. The journey home across the Atlantic provided no celebration for the exhausted crew of submarine B-59. Captain Savitsky's vessel limped toward Soviet naval bases with damaged equipment and a crew traumatized by their ordeal beneath the Caribbean Sea. The men who had come within minutes of starting nuclear war maintained strict silence about their experiences, bound by classification requirements and military discipline that would last for decades. Official debriefings began immediately upon B-59's return to port in late November 1962. Soviet naval intelligence demanded detailed accounts of the submarine's encounter with American forces, but these reports were classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The existence of nuclear weapons aboard Soviet submarines remained one of the most sensitive military secrets, known only to a handful of senior officials in Moscow and the Pentagon. Arkhipov's refusal to authorize nuclear launch created significant controversy within Soviet naval circles that would affect his career for years. Some commanders praised his analytical thinking and restraint under extreme pressure. Others questioned whether his hesitation had represented a failure of nerve that could have cost Soviet lives if the tactical situation had deteriorated further. The debate remained internal and classified, never reaching public attention or historical records. The deputy commander's naval career continued without obvious punishment, but also without the recognition that his momentous decision clearly merited. Soviet military culture valued obedience and aggressive action over independent judgment and moral courage. Officers who followed orders, even mistaken ones, received promotions and preferred assignments. Those who made unauthorized decisions, regardless of their ultimate wisdom, faced subtle discrimination throughout their remaining service. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolution and subsequent nuclear test ban treaty created a new atmosphere of cautious cooperation between the superpowers that recognized how close they had come to mutual destruction. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev implemented safeguards designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. However, the submarine encounters remained classified for decades, limiting their impact on policy discussions about nuclear weapons and crisis management. For Arkhipov personally, the burden of secrecy proved psychologically devastating over the long term. He had prevented nuclear war through a decision that required enormous moral courage under impossible circumstances. But he could never discuss his role with family, friends, or colleagues. The knowledge that he had saved millions of lives remained locked away in classified files while the world continued its existence without ever knowing how close it had come to annihilation. The story of Vasili Arkhipov's crucial role in preventing nuclear war remained buried in Soviet military archives for over 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The submarine encounters of October 1962 were classified at levels that prevented even Cold War historians from accessing relevant documents. Only the gradual opening of Russian military records during the 1990s allowed researchers to piece together the full story of how close B-59 had come to launching its nuclear torpedo. The first detailed accounts of the incident appeared in scholarly publications during the late 1990s, just as Arkhipov was entering his final years. The man who had prevented World War III learned that his story was finally being told to a world that had never known how close it had come to nuclear destruction.